Thank you, Faizur, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for being here for this presentation. I know you all had a tough morning, a lot of interesting presentations, and usually the presentation after lunch is a good place to have a power nap, but I hope that I will have an interesting presentation for you, so you all still kept listening, and then we all have our coffee booster after this. As you can see, my presentation today is about peer-to-peer trading and system services for the DSO. Okay, that's fine. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Okay. The outline of my presentation today is going to give you a bit of context of where and how we started this study on peer-to-peer trading and the impact they will have on the grid services. A bit of a background on our inputs for this study, different mechanisms that are there in existing literature and projects for the grid service acquisition, and then we will reach to the main core of this presentation, which is the peer-to-peer and flexibility services, and I will give you some examples on the concepts that we have developed. As I said, this work that I will present to you is a part of a project, a Horizon 2020 project called Universal, which is an abbreviation of Market Enabling Interface to Unlock Flexibility Solution for Cost-Effective Management of Smarter Distribution Grids. This project has started in 2019 and will finish in 2023. A lot of references in my presentation are going to this project. I have put the direct deliverables that I use the content from. So if you are interested in any of the figures or the content, you can always have access to these deliverables as they are publicly available online. As you can see in this slide, in this project, we were trying to make a platform that combines all the flexibility option and flexibility services that are mandatory requirements of the DSOs for a better operation of a smart grids via a smart platform and an aggregated and collected platform that could provide, through a market-based approach, these services to whoever may require. This platform is going to have a lot of interactors, but the main the main users are going to be FSPs, which are the flexibility service providers, and of course the DSOs, who are the main flexibility requesters. But as you know, providing such interface and platform has a lot of dimensions, and it will touch a lot of aspects. Comes from the energy policy, environmental aspects, society, and then to upscaling and integration that will be used in all the member states in Europe. And for that, because the idea is to provide a platform that is usable for all the member states, we try to use and be consistent with the descriptions and definitions that have been provided by the European Commission for all the flexibility services and for all the actors and the domains that we are considering in this project. So, before I go a bit further, I want to know how many of you have a background in power system engineering. Okay, so we are more or less half and half. I'm happy that I have provided a bit of a background on the terminology that I will use here, because not all of them may be known to those who do not have background in power system engineering. DSOs are the distribution system operators, and for providing a safe, secure, and smooth operation in this network, they have specific needs. Here there is a list of what DSOs need. The main and most important on the distribution grid is the physical congestion, where the flow of a distribution line may exceed of the capacity and the physical limit of the grid and of the lines. Then it is the control of the voltage violation. All the measurements in the distribution grid, they all have certain values that needs to be kept under a certain allowed margin of violation. So DSOs need to ensure that these voltage are remaining in this margin that is allowed. The network planning, with the growth of the load, with the growth of the local resources, network planning is another mandatory aspect that the DSOs needs to take into account. Phase balancing, support to planned and unplanned operations, support to extreme events, and support to islanding are further technical aspects that the DSOs needs to take into account, but I will not go further into that. But we should understand that there is one aspect when we talk about the DSO needs, and there is another aspect that we call as a flexibility service. Here we try to show this matching of what is the flexibility, what is the need of the DSO, and what are the terminology and what are the defined services, flexibility services, that can be provided by whoever has this flexibility in the grid to the DSO. You can see that a lot of the DSO needs, so the DSO problems, can be solved by corrective and predictive congestion management. This means that a certain service can solve multiple needs of the DSO. And that is important to take into account because of the consequences that providing congestion management and flexibility by each of the flexibility service providers may have in the system, as well as the fact that when they are going to be paid or reimbursed for the flexibility that they have provided to the system. Looking at this, when we try to match the needs and the flexibility services, we found that there are some services that are more important than the others, and we took them as our priority services to be considered. Congestion management, voltage control, and loss minimization are the main three services that we are considering. So, what is the process that the DSO takes into account to identify what is the service that is required and how much flexibility is needed for that specific service? As I said, congestion management, voltage control, and loss minimization are the most important ones. Each DSO, they're equipped with several tools. The most important one are power flow tools and OPF. They do a study of the system status. They quantify the amount of flexibility that they need, and they try to define some kind of control strategy on the assets that they have. Of course, you also see that providing those flexibility and operation of the system has different time frames. Some of them can be solved in a day-ahead approach, which means 24 hours before the occurrence, and some of them can be treated in an intraday, or sometimes should be and only could be treated in an intraday approach because that's how they are being even covered. They are the timeline of the congestion that has occurred hasn't been known to the DSO in a day ahead time scale. Now we have learned about the services. Now we want to go to see what are the mechanisms for acquiring those services. And here you can see some of the most well-known and most common approaches that the DSOs nowadays in Europe are using. Flexible access and connection agreement, dynamic network tariffs, local flexibility markets, bilateral contracts, cost-based mechanism, and obligations. through this mechanism, the DSO and all the other players that are existing in the distribution grid, such as aggregators, flexibility service providers, distributed energy resources, they will go into a negotiation, a type of contract with each other to provide the services that the DSO need by the resources that the flexibility providers have. Here I also have provided a bit more of a context on each of these mechanisms, because then we want to reach to a point that where peer-to-peer trading plays a role in all these mechanisms. One of the most common and mostly used mechanisms for acquiring flexibility services currently in Europe is flexible access and connection agreements, which means that all the flexibility service providers that are connected to the distribution grid, they already make a contract or some kind of agreement with the DSO that they will provide a certain amount that has already been negotiated and agreed of flexibility to the DSO. Of course, here you see that it is more on the regulated side. There already are many known factors here. Distribution system operator will be prone to less uncertainty if a certain problem is going to happen. So that's why this is the most common that is being currently used. And here you can see the process of how these agreements are going to be put into a contract. For example, they start with what are the information on the availability of the capacity on that connection point, and what would be the cost of incurring the available capacity, and they will calculate this amount of capacity. They allocate to specific flexibility service providers this calculated capacity, and then they apply the connection charges. Of course, this process would be different with different user segments, because they have different charges depending on where they are connected. Another variedly used mechanism is the dynamic network tariffs. I'm sure all of you have heard of it. Through dynamic network tariffs, the distribution system tries to create variations on the flow based on the cost that will be incurred towards that specific quantity of the flow. Yeah, unfortunately here, these photos, I'm not sure that you can read them well, but this is the process of defining or designing these tariffs. Here, we should calculate what is the cost of congestion and what is the cost of the energy losses and all the other related network costs. There are main principles that always needs to be taken into account when you are designing a tariff, which are economic efficiency, equity, and transparency. All the tariffs needs to be compliant with these principles. And then, based on these, we will design different chargers based on the type of the resource that we have. Usually you apply different charges if there are generators, consumers, or storages, or there are based on like energy charges, capacity charges, or there are fixed charges. They can be different in the dynamic tariff design. Another aspect of these kind of tariffs is their granularity. Some of them, they have a locational granularity, and some are more temporal granular. Another important and very trendy mechanism is the local flexibility markets. And you all have seen local flexibility markets a lot of time in all these energy, community, user-centric based papers. What are the local flexibility markets and how are they being put into operation? But we should all take that into account, that there is still a gap between what is in the literature and what is in practice, and what can be considered as an up and running local flexibility market. The Based on definition, local flexibility markets include long-term and short-term pools in which offers are received from FSPs. And here you can see the process of setting up a local flexibility market. The preparation of what are the requirements in participating in local flexibility markets, what are the pre-qualifications, who can be a participant, forecasting of what would be the requirements that needs to be covered by each snapshot of the market running, then the market operation itself, monitoring and activation of the selected flexibility bids, and finally measurement and settlement. And if you go through the literature on this aspect, you see that there are still a lot of points that needs to be addressed on each of these steps towards the flexibility, mostly on the measurement and settlement of the flexibility that has been provided. Bilateral contract is a more regulated form of the contract or the agreement and is being it's a binding contract between the two parties that they will agree on providing a certain level of service, whichever the other one has provided on the contract and whichever is causing the problem on the distribution network. Cost-based mechanism is another approach that based on the quantity that each of the flexibility service providers are injecting to the grid or using from the grid, and they are solving a certain issue that has been requested by the DSO, they will be remunerated for that amount of flexibility. And finally, is the obligation that they are required, some FSPs are required to provide a certain amount of flexibility wherever is requested, because then they may jeopardize the operation of the distribution system operator. So, having said that, we are going to do another survey on the DSO needs and the flexibility services, and what triggers each of these needs and services. Here you can see the same list of the DSO needs, and here you can see the flexibility services that I have tried to somehow explain. And here, these are the triggers that will so this is the need, this is the trigger, and this is the service that needs to be provided to the DSO by one of these mechanisms that I have just explained. But what should be our criteria on choosing these mechanisms? Or is there the possibility of having multiple mechanisms if we want to provide flexibility in a distribution network? In this table, you will see the compatibility analysis on various mechanisms in providing two main services. This one is for the congestion management, which is provided by the active power and is the most requested service by the DSO. And the next one we will see the voltage control. As you can see, the flexible connection and access agreement is mostly agreeable with the rest of the mechanisms, while obligation and cost-based mechanism they have contradictory aspects when we have existence of, for example, bilateral contracts and cost-based. For example, when you have a bilateral contract, only the two parties on the contract are aware of what is the quantity that is going to be traded, while the cost-based, this quantity needs to be known to the DSO that will calculate the cost inferred by each of those trades. And here you can see that voltage control is even more problematic in that sense. So when we want to have voltage control that deals with the reactive power, existence of multiple mechanisms together may be conflicting in providing the solution to the DSO, especially dynamic network tariffs. We had a project for the Belgian TSO and 3 of the DSOs to design the dynamic tariff, but we never could reach an agreement on the for the voltage control. We tried some solutions for the congestion management, but we never could reach a conclusion on the voltage control. And this actually has been subject of study in many, not many, at least some of the recent European projects, but I personally haven't seen an optimal answer on how you can use dynamic network tariffs for voltage control. Anyway, so we come to this balance that the local flexibility market, which is a market-based approach that provide a platform to different decentralized flexibility providers that can be operated locally and that will be one step forward towards the decentralization, has some positive aspects, but also has some negative aspects. The same goes for more regulated mechanisms. And you have seen that depending on the status of the network, depending on which member state we are talking about, they may use different mechanisms. Actually, we did a survey and we have asked different DSOs in the member states on their preferred mechanism on for which specific type of fault in the system, which mechanism would be better. And these information are available in this deliverable 5.1. You can have access to that on the website. And you can see it is quite diverse depending on which member state we talk about. But we come to the main question here, which is peer-to-peer. So we talked about the local flexibility markets. We talked about decentralization, which is the recent trend in the literature and the recent questions that are being asked by the system operators. And we want to see if we want to enable peer-to-peer trading, what happens to the grid services? How we can ensure DSOs that although peer-to-peer trading by definition are going to be something that happens between 2 parties, how the DSO can be sure of its a smooth operation and how it can make sure of the required flexibility that it needs and on its activation. And for that, we need to first go to the definition of the peer-to-peer trading that has been provided by the European Commission and in the Clean Energy Package. Peer-to-peer trading, by this definition, actually provides us with a broader option of peer-to-peer trading. So it talks about the sale of renewable energy between market participants by means of a contract, of course, either directly between market participants or indirectly through a certified third-party market participant. So, with that being said, we can have a range or different levels of peer-to-peer trading. That comes on a community basis, so the renewable energy communities or local energy communities or citizen energy communities. Within their communities, they can trade. Group of buildings, on a building level, they can trade, and finally, individuals. So each of these definitions can be interpreted as different levels that provide a peer-to-peer energy. With this aspect, we can see that we can go one step further and provide or consider each of the peers as a flexibility service provider to the DSO. And here's where the most of the challenge would come when we want to combine the peer-to-peer trading with the grid services. As you can see, we have here is just a representation of peer-to-peer and grid services. If we consider this line the distribution grid, there can be a microgrid or a community that within that microgrid or community they will trade with each other, or each of these communities will trade with each other, and all of them, they can provide services to the distribution network. So here is our main question. Here is our research question. We want to move from centralized approaches, such as local flexibility market, such as dynamic tariffs, such as fixed cost of flexibility service provision for the DSOs, to more decentralized approaches. And one of them is the peer-to-peer trading. How we can define or design a concept that matches these two worlds, where inherently these two are not colliding. Because peer-to-peer trading on its own is actually a financial trading, it's a financial agreement, while distribution really deals with the network and with the physical layer and the amount. For that, we have defined these design elements. Network constraints, which is an important aspect for the DSO, how this service is being provided, how peer-to-peers will trade, what is the geographical scope that we are talking about, what are the services, based on the service definition that I made in the beginning, what are the market sequences, what is the trade product that can be traded between the peers, what are the roles that will be involved, and what is the pricing scheme if we want to have peer-to-peer trading for the system services. Now we will go to each of these elements. Network constraints, it's quite an obvious one. If we want to be conscious and aware of what is the status of the network, then our peer-to-peer matching needs to take into consideration the network constraint. Many argue that this is in contradiction with the inherent definition of the peer-to-peer trading, because peers need to be able to trade with each other regardless of whatever is going to happen in the network. But here we give the options. Either they consider network constraints or they do not consider the network constraints. What are the services? And this is an interesting aspect. You see, there are two peers, they trade with each other, they do not care about the network, their quantity will cause a problem in the distribution network, and they do not care because it's a distribution operator's responsibility to solve it. Then we have two other peers. The amount of energy that they will trade will cause a problem for the distribution network. So they take into consideration the network constraints, and they will redirect or change the quantity of the energy that they will trade with a different price or with some kind of incentives. By this aspect, implicitly, they are providing a service to the DSO. Why? By not causing further problems, by not causing further congestion to the system. And the third group are two peers. They are trading for the sake of the DSO. Let's take into account, for my friends here who have a background in the power system engineering, that you are dealing with a couple of prosumers. At the end of your radial-based network, that there is also a micro wind turbine. For you not to curtail the wind, your peers that are located there, they need to trade capacity that whenever we have wind, this specific peer will consume. So they are trading for the capacity that is required by the DSO. And with that, we have defined these three elements of service provision. So the first group, no service. The second one, implicit services. And the third one, which are the explicit services that will be provided by the peer-to-peer trading. Another important aspect is how the peers are going to trade. Are they going to trade bilaterally, or they are going to have auction-based trading where there is a mediator involved? Why that is important? Because when we have two peers randomly located in a network, and they will somehow decide to trade with each other, then they may cause a lot of loss by the specific trade that they are considering. While when there is a mediator who will decide on this matching, and we want to impose the network constraint, the mediator will have the option of preventing that kind of trade. Again, these are just extreme examples. These do not happen in practice. The third one is the geographical scope. As I said, on the definition of the peer-to-peer trading, we can have different levels of providing services from the peer. So either peer can provide the service to the grid, so directly the DSO would be the requester, to the utility within a community or a microgrid, peer-to-peer through a third party, which is also a community, and finally peer-to-peer, so like two neighboring peers that are located on the same feeder, for example. The third one is the market sequence, and that is important if we have other markets happening simultaneously with the peer-to-peer energy trading. Imagine if we have another local energy market. Imagine if we have another local flexibility market. What is the sequence of that happening with the peer-to-peer trading? Are they sequential? Are they iterative? Peer-to-peer is happening continuously, and then we have the local flexibility market. This is also an important aspect in the concept. Another important aspect is what we define as the product that the peers are going to trade among each other. Are they going to trade energy and only energy, or they are going to trade also flexibility? And these can be considered as the attributes of the flexibility. What is the direction of the quantity that they are going to trade? What is the power capacity, the starting time, duration, and the location? And why is that different? Because on the previous aspect of the service provision that I have mentioned, when two peers decide on trading energy, then implicitly they can provide a system service. While they decide on capacity, explicitly they can provide a service to the DSO. What are the roles? This is I think, very well-known figure for whoever has worked on peer-to-peer trading that shows there are different roles that are involved in the peer-to-peer trading. If we want to add the system services to that, of course, DSO will also make an important role. Other than that, energy communities, microgrid operators, aggregators, flexibility service providers, prosumers, all are having a role here as well. And finally, what we can use as an incentive, as a new pricing scheme to redirect our peer-to-peer trading in a way that they actually help the DSO. And we try to make a survey in the literature of existing papers published in this field that these are the most common ones. Either exogenous cost allocations, such as network usage price. Like this, we have a peer-to-peer platform, and they are using a distribution network for their trades. But they have to pay a network usage charge based on the quantity of the trade that has been matched. Another common approach is the constraint-based, which certain numbers of coefficients are being added to the objective function of the peer-to-peer matching. For example, a coefficient weighted by the voltage criteria, by loss criteria, and also by congestion, so flow of the lines. And these will have an impact on the selection of the peer-to-peer trading. So automatically, it will prevent those that will elevate any of the network constraints. And here is a summary of service provision in current literature. So we have seen that there are, whenever they wanted to have considered any of the services, they all included the network constraints within the peer-to-peer matching process. There were only one example of the balancing, which was, so it is not balancing as we know it in the transmission system operator balancing. It is balancing within a microgrid for the sake of the energy community. Most of them, they have considered implicit services, which mean that they are not being requested a certain quantity of capacity by the DSO. Rather, their energy matching is being constrained by the network constraints. However, there are some examples of the explicit as well. Most of them are auction-based. Why? Because it is much easier to impose the network constraint when you have an auction rather than bilateral. And most of them, for the technical approaches, they have considered the constraint optimization, while some game theory models are also existent, especially for congestion management and voltage control. Here are also some of the examples of the peer-to-peer energy trading. Again, if you go to the details of the models that they have considered in these projects or for the peer-to-peer trading, you will see that they are not pure peer-to-peer trading. Most of them, they have some level of centralization, either in their modeling, in their running of the model, or in their matching process. So, with all this introduction, we reach to this point that we have our concepts. We think there can be two main approaches for the peer-to-peers to provide services, either explicit grid services or implicit grid services. In the explicit grid services, the flexibility will be the trade product, and for the implicit, they can be energy as the trade product. The network constraints for the explicit grid services is a pre-qualification, which means that the DSO already has a forecast on the quantity of the capacity that is going to be needed, and that is what is communicated to the peers, and peers are going to trade on that. On the implicit grid services is a post-qualification, which means that peers first submit their preferred matched quantity. It will, one entity, a third party, will run the power flow, will see the system status. If that doesn't cause any problems, those trades will go through. Let's consider that they cause problems. We've considered two approaches. One, which is a more simple one, is trade blocking. So if a trade causes a network constraint and are going to cause any kind of congestion or voltage problems, it is going to be blocked and another pair needs to match. Another approach is to define the incentives. So by adding the incentive, which is weighted by the amount of the trade that has been considered, or by the user preferences, there will be a change in the quantity, which requires a renegotiation of the peers, and this requires other levels of iteration. And finally, for other flex mechanism, we have only considered local flexibility market, which is the most trendy one and most challenging one in terms of modeling and going through with it. But as you can see, this can always be added as a next step for all the peers. Here, I want to show you some of the examples of the sequence of how these will work. So let's consider that we have an energy community, we have a microgrid, or we have an auction-based peer-to-peer trading, that there is a mediator responsible for matching the bids that they receive from the peer. And this mediator also is informed of the network constraints and the requirements of where the peers are located. So it already considers that the peers will not cause problems within the area that the peers are located. It receives the bids, considers these constraints, and matches the bid. But there is a trick to it. There is also the LFM opportunity existence for the mediator. So the mediator has to decide if it makes more sense to match all the bids on the peer-to-peer trading or keep some level of flexibility from peers to be offered to the local flexibility market. And somehow this mediator can manipulate the local flexibility market. And this is one of the things that we are quantifyingly analyzing currently to see how this structure can have an impact on the local flexibility market. Another aspect is pure bilateral. Let's consider that the peers are trading bilaterally, but they also want to provide services to the DSO. And here, the DSO itself comes into play, and all the initially matched bids are being reported to the DSO. DSO runs the power flow and see how it's going to be, gives feedback to each of the peers. Peers do the redispatching, and then new rounds of the matched bids are going to be sent to the DSO until it reaches a convergence that none of the peer matching would cause any problem in the DSO. And finally is the bilateral peer-to-peer trading with the local flexibility markets. Peers will trade regardless of what is the status of the network, but peers know that they also have the option of the local flexibility market. So we consider this peer, that is can also be a local flexibility provider, and it wants to match some of this energy through peers and also participate in the local flexibility market. Local flexibility market is the main mechanism for providing flexibility to the DSO. That's why there is one round of interaction between the DSO and LFM as well. This is another example that we are currently trying to quantify how it will have an impact on each other, what would be the revenues of the peers and what would be the cost of the local flexibility market. With that being said, this is an ongoing project, it's an ongoing task. As I mentioned, these were the conceptual models that we have developed. Currently, we are analyzing them with the different data, and we hope that we would be able to not only qualitatively, but also quantitatively compare each of these concepts and reach a conclusion on which of them would be a better option for the peer-to-peer to provide services. Thank you very much for your attention, and happy to take any questions.